Well, my name is Fiona Skinner. I coordinate the Industrial Decarbonisation Initiative, or IDDI. And the IDDI is an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial, which is coordinated by UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, where I sit. The IDDI was launched in 2021 under the leadership of the UK and India, and has since grown to 10 government members. So beyond UK and India, we have Brazil, Canada, Germany, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Sweden, the UAE, and the United States currently as members. And we also bring together over 70 stakeholders from a variety of different sectors across academia, the private sector, government, and civil society. And broadly speaking, we aim to deliver concrete action in support of both developed and developing countries' efforts to decarbonizing the hard-to-abate sectors, starting with steel, cement, and concrete. We do that by, on the one hand, advocating for public procurement commitments to stimulate demand for green products, and then on the other hand, by harmonizing systems for carbon reporting and the benchmarking of industrial products. So again, with the focus of steel, cement, and concrete. So in September 2022, we launched an updated Green Public Procurement Pledge, to which we have been calling on governments to sign up to. The pledge, crucially, is open to national, but also subnational governments, and is structured as 4 levels, which build on one another. So those 4 levels range from a level 1, which focuses on the disclosure of embodied carbon in cement, concrete, and steel procured for public construction projects. And so really there, we're looking at the disclosure via environmental product declarations, which we heard a lot about earlier, or any other third-party verified digital format that covers the same aspects as an EPD. And this is all really about making sure that we understand the baseline, we understand what we are measuring, and making sure that, you know, you can't manage what you can't measure. So we need that data, first of all. Level 2 is really about conducting whole project lifecycle assessments for all public construction projects. And at the same time, also making sure that by 2050, we are achieving net zero emissions in all public construction projects. And here we're really talking about aligning policy and net zero goals, making sure that the broader governmental goals that governments have been making under the Paris Agreement are also really trickling down to procurement and making that explicit commitment to procurement as well. And then levels 3 and 4 are about actual commitments to procuring low and near zero emissions steel, cement, and concrete for public construction projects. So we leave the level of ambition to the committing countries in terms of the emissions reduction that they can achieve for low emissions according to a series of bands. And then near zero emissions, we're really focusing on the procurement of near zero emissions materials for signature projects only as a first step. So at the moment where we stand is that last year in September, we had 4 governments commit to reporting back on what levels they can commit to by COP28. So we expect that announcement in just about 1 month. I won't be able to let the cat out of the bag just yet in terms of what they are committing to, but we're working very hard on that announcement, and I hope you all stay tuned for that.
Oh, that sounds great. So thank you very much, Fiona. Nancy Gillis, could you tell us more about the First Movers Coalition? So what's the idea behind it, and probably what's the advantage for companies to join the FMC?
Great, thank you, and thanks for this opportunity to participate. So the First Movers Coalition is on the demand side. There's great conversation that happened during the last session about how public procurement can serve as a demand signal. The First Movers Coalition is the private sector demand signal. So it's a program that is managed between the World Economic Forum, which serves as the secretariat, and the United States through the Department of State. It also is comprised, though, of additional governments as government partners. Those governments including Japan, Canada, Denmark, Italy, Norway, Singapore, UAE, and the UK. And the purpose of the First Movers Coalition is to aggregate demand in what we call the heavy industry sectors. So this is having private companies agree or commit to buying near zero versions of either steel, cement and concrete, or aluminum. And then also in long range transportation sectors of shipping, trucking, and aviation. And we have worked very closely with IDDI and Fiona personally in that level 4 area, because when our private sector members of the First Movers Coalition make a commitment in the steel sector or in the cement and concrete sector, what they're doing is putting their same purchasing power in support of those sectors in the way that governments are increasingly doing as well. And they are buying either directly or as influencing purchases, like real estate designers or so forth. They're buying these near zero versions of cement, concrete, or steel that we've talked about that we want to see pulled into the market more quickly. And to close out, the First Movers Coalition is really looking at near zero products and services that meet that definition, utilizing a number of clean technologies or fuel sources. Not all apply. These are fuel sources such as hydrogen, green ammonia. They are technologies such as CCUS. As examples, these are ones in which we understand that in creating a demand function through private sector purchasing, it can serve to pull forward these technologies faster than they're currently organically expected to commercialize. So these are technologies and fuel sources that aren't bleeding edge, but they're still innovative and cutting edge. And we hope that the FMC demand signal pulls them forward into commercialization by 2030 so that they're more broadly available to meet 2050 decarbonization goals. So with that, let me hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Nancy Gillis. So, Tor, in your project, probably you could explain us in some examples, what is your main focus to driving change in projects?
Yeah, so I work at the IPA and as part of the authority.
Microphone, we have to turn on. And no, right? No.
Is that working now?
Now it's working. Yes.
Thank you. So yes, as part of IPA, we look after major government project delivery. So as part of that, we're driving best practices, and within our team specifically, we are embedding our Transforming Infrastructure Performance program, and that is about driving best practice and principles around leveraging data, digital maturity, delivery models, how we collaborate with industry, for example, so that we can achieve our shared vision for the sector. So between, as part of the initiative of TIP, we have a shared vision for the future, so that we collectively prioritize and optimize benefits and outcomes for society and nature, and for that to become the basis of how we intervene in the built environment. And carbon is one of the sort of initial focus areas for us. So 2 years ago, the Cabinet Office released something called the Construction Playbook, which sets out how government should procure construction works. And as part of that, we mandated the requirement for whole life carbon assessment to be done for buildings and infrastructure projects. So I've been working across government to standardize how we assess and report whole life carbon. But because government don't procure low carbon products, we need to move towards sort of looking at how do we drive that emphasis on decarbonisation in general. So we're looking at how we embed sort of pragmatic approach to decarbonisation, making sure that whilst it's important to drive the demand for low carbon products, we need to emphasize on that focus on decarbonisation solutions and approaches as a whole, so that we don't drive unintended sort of disadvantages or advantages in specific areas. So part of that is, you might have heard of the past 2080 carbon management in buildings and infrastructure. So we're looking at how we can incorporate that within our delivery bodies. So Department for Transport, for example, have already required sort of their delivery bodies to achieve accreditation for past 2080. So we're looking at how can we make sure that we incorporate those carbon reduction hierarchy, and make sure that we are able to drive meaningful actions in the absence of good data. So making sure that we are actually decarbonising and being comfortable with the state of the data that we have now, so that we don't delay achieving our sort of net zero agenda as part of that.
Okay, so it's again about data. That's very important, especially for you as a scientist. Rainer Quitzow, your research focuses on sustainable innovation and industrial policy and geopolitics of transitions in energy and industry. So in a very general question, but what kind of innovative strategies do we need when you listen to these inputs?
Well, I mean, what I was maybe going to comment on is one of the questions, because that was the kind of the title of the session, about how do we now, we've heard about the US, we've heard now about the UK, so how do we bring this all together, right? And we've heard a lot about the problem of carbon leakage and competition. So, and I think, I mean, of course, we want that to happen, right? We want these markets to grow and become bigger and potentially transatlantic, build critical mass in terms of demand to really catalyze new investment. I don't really see a problem. I thought it was kind of interesting, this question of like, isn't this going to take away all the products, all the clean products from the private market? It's kind of like, well, yeah, because it's creating demand, and we want that demand so that companies will invest. And so, but then when we start looking at harmonization of these policies across the Atlantic, for example, we see similar questions arising to what we've seen or what we've talked about in terms of like sectors competing against each other. We also have the countries competing against each other. And then we have this problem of, you know, do we do sort of more like an average approach, or do we try to really create these kind of niche markets? And in both cases, we kind of have a competitive problem, because in one case, what can happen, we can have ring fencing, and we can have certain facilities being really, really green in another country, but the rest of the economy is really dirty. And then those small islands become maybe very successful exporters into an ambitious second country market, right? Or we go for more the average, but then we might have the problem that, you know, those that, for example, just happen to have a slightly cleaner sector in the first place do much better in international competition, and there's no incentive really to go beyond that. And I mean, this, I'm just kind of throwing out some problems or some challenges. And I think the question is, you know, how do we bring these things together? Because nobody's going to want to sort of forfeit their own local manufacturing and the competitive advantage of their local manufacturing base. Yeah, and that's kind of the challenge we're looking at also, and maybe we'll talk about that in a second, in these negotiations that we're seeing in the steel and aluminum sector to bring the US and Europe into the same boat.
So what kind of collaborations do we need to solve this problem or this challenge?
I think we need to leverage the differences in maturity across different countries, but also within countries in terms of different sectors, because that, I think, allow us to, one, be able to accelerate different policies, but also being able to learn from people that have actually been in the implementation phase, because we risk, I think, in trying to be ambitious in driving some of these low carbon policy forwards, if we don't think about the consequences of what this drives, we could end up in a space where we actually venture into an area where our sort of good intents become regressive in what we're trying to achieve. So we need to look at where's everyone in terms of that maturity journey, and how can we best learn from each other as part of that, I guess, global roadmap for the decarbonisation agenda. Yes, I think that's...
Okay, that leads me to a question to Fiona Skinner. I saw that Canada, Germany, and the UK will report on green public procurement commitments at the COP28 in November. So, what do you think about that, and where do you see the power in general of green public procurement?
Well, I think it's great, obviously, but I do wish there were more. And so I think really the power that we have with green public procurement is that public procurement represents such a vast portion of the market for particularly industrial products, steel, cement, and concrete. And so if we have that demand signal coming from governments that is aggregated, that's really a huge signal to the private sector to come in and invest in those low emissions, but also near zero emissions technologies that we need in order to facilitate the transition. I think when we talk about collaboration and strategies for accelerating this, one of the key challenges and one of the things to overcome that we have seen is that within government, it is quite a challenge to have this intragovernmental coordination in order to accelerate these commitments. So when we think about procurement, of course, there are some obvious departments that are responsible, but really this is a conversation that spans ministries of energy, ministries of industry, minister of climate, and then specific departments of commerce or competition, trade, you name it. All of them are involved. So this is a huge organizational and collaborative lift. And so on the one hand, there needs to be a champion that's driving this forward, but the sort of vast amount of sort of behind the scenes coordination that is required to get to these commitments is something that I really want to highlight. So these countries that are reporting by COP28, they're really the first movers, and they're demonstrating tremendous leadership in pushing this forward.
Okay, Tor, the question goes also to you. So your UK is one of the first movers in that way. So what do we need to implement this good action?
So for us, I guess we're using government project delivery, so our major project procurement, as a way of translating some of those policies. So we're taking that leadership and that leap, I guess, through our very own projects to make sure that we are implementing what we said we are going to. So the construction playbook is an example. We have a big sort of net zero agenda as part of that. We are working through incorporating those updated sort of standardization around whole life carbon assessment, for example, but also working closely with industry. How can we leverage what industry clients are able to move forward so that we can accelerate policy development, because they are sort of a vehicle for being able to provide that evidence base of what works, what doesn't, so that we can sort of close that loop around policy development, implementation, but also evidence to support improvement, so that we can make more progress.
Nancy Gillis, to go into details again. So in the First Movers Coalition, you promise your companies that you're building the clean supply chains for the future or of the future. So, but how do you, what's the main step to decarbonize supply chains?
That's a good question. So the First Movers Coalition is comprised now of almost 90 companies. We are seeking to raise that number to 100 by COP28. And obviously, when they're making a commitment in a sector that they buy from, So when you think about some of the companies that are members, many of them, such as Volvo Group as an example, you think about what they actually are as a supplier, but here they are a company that's signing up and joining the program as a buyer. And so the way that they're forcing through their purchasing power a shift in their not only supply chain but value chain is by they don't only make the commitment to buy the products and services, and it tends to be 10% of the total volume of what they're buying. So this would be near zero steel by our definition, or the same kind of comparable volume amount in cement and concrete. But they're actually moving forward to make advanced purchase agreements. And I think this is what keeps coming up in some of these conversations is it's necessary if we want to actually decarbonize certain sectors and we want to go ahead and make those manufacturers be less carbon intensive in their practices, then we need to show them that there's an actual customer there. And that customer promise isn't satisfied purely with a memorandum of understanding. There actually needs to be a contract because that's what they need to take to get the financing. And as we all know, the financing necessary to transition companies, existing companies, or to actually bring new companies into the market for these sectors is not a small amount. So that's what FMC members are promising. They are promising to actually contract with existing and new suppliers to meet their commitments. And that's really what's necessary to facilitate increased availability of these near zero products and services. Now, one thing I want to add, a value that we've seen for first movers that honestly we weren't able to forecast is the value of the value chain. So what we're seeing is that members within the first movers are actually coming together with their suppliers, but also their customers, and sometimes even their competitors. Because again, to create that much of demand and meet the demand, it can't just be one player like it used to be before. You really need to have every chain member in the value chain understand their role and agree to support it. Or else what you have is unnecessary competition, confusion, inefficiencies, and we just don't have the sector starting to decarbonize. So yes, supply chains are important, but increasingly what we're having to focus on is the actual value chain. I hope I understood your question.
So thank you very much for that. Rainer Quitzow, probably also this question for you from a geopolitical point of view. What do you think are the biggest challenges for decarbonizing the supply chains?
I mean, I think we've been, like I said before, I mean, one of the things that everyone's talking now about is this idea of carbon leakage. So, so how do we sort of apply these standards or the CO2 prices to bring down CO2 emissions in a local market or a domestic market? And what does that do to international competition? But then also the reverse, and it's also, I guess I touched upon that before, sort of like, is there, now there's also the fear that if we push too hard on decarbonization, for example, in Europe, that other players outside of Europe will actually be the ones that have the renewable resources to produce those low carbon or near zero carbon. I didn't know that term yet. Those near zero carbon products and services. So there's the fear that, you know, those industries might also move out because there's better conditions for producing low carbon elsewhere. And now it's kind of like it's very difficult, I think, for governments to sort of gauge whether, you know, they're subsidizing locally a losing sort of low carbon industry in the long term because the local conditions aren't there to actually sustain it over the long term. For example, green steel making in Europe, or whether they're investing in, you know, long-term employment and value creation in their domestic economy going forward. And this is kind of where we're at right now. And that's why I think, well, we need to discuss. I think it's exactly right to sort of talk about value chains and in a broader sense, because I think it's the wrong approach to hope or expect that, you know, we will retain value creation in the specific areas that we have been competitive in the past, in the dirty economy, let's say, and that we may be actually more competitive in other segments of the value chain going forward, and other countries, other regions might be more competitive in the segments we were competitive in the past. Yeah, and it's a difficult situation, and I think it's also a risk if we expect this to be purely driven by economics, right? Because policy and politics will play a role also in sort of reshaping the landscape in the end, and so it has to be a mix between economics and politics in the end.
A mix, but how would you define a mix? Like, what kind of collaboration stands behind this mix you're talking about?
What I mean by mix is that I think there's always a case for a certain sort of core of green value creation in basic materials like steel and chemicals, even if, you know, for example, Germany doesn't have very good renewable resources to sort of supply those industries into the future. But nonetheless, there needs to be a core, right? A core sort of level of value creation and industrial production regardless. And we need to invest into that. And I think there's, we can do that also politically with procurement rules, for example. But we need to also discuss working with partners and finding ways to build international value chains where we're comfortable with the supply relationships that we're going to build up.
So there's a question in the audience, therefore I look there. But one question to Nancy Gillis also concerning that. Do you think the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is a good instrument for that? Or is
we were going to be friendly during this conversation, weren't we?
Yes. Positive.
So let me step back for a moment, and instead of focusing purely on that, but that's a very important one. I think it goes to the answer that was just given, which is, I think there needs to be a synergy, and without it, it won't work, between government policy and private sector demand. And that synergy is, first and foremost, creating a harmonization of, especially if you're using public procurement, when you're saying, like IDDI defines what is near zero steel, like responsible steel was mentioned as well. How do you actually define what it is that you're purchasing and create as much consistency in that definition so that you're aggregating both public and private sector demand? But then when you start making components of that definition, sometimes it is out of the scope of private sector industry to meet. Access to renewable energy. It's not only the access, it is the infrastructure necessary to ensure that access. And that's something where government really plays a role. And then, of course, it's the approach that government takes. So whether or not it is something like the IRA in the United States, which is considered by many much more of a carrot, or if you start thinking about a stick approach. And the challenge, I think, is for industry having to respond to both when they are seen as disparate or different, versus many of these players are global players trying to find some commonality between them. So I would say, building off of the last speaker, his comments being very, very relevant, there needs to be this synergy between government and private sector. And there are very specific policies and roles, or specific policies and a specific role that government can play that the private sector requires as an enabling environment to do what they're supposed to do on the demand side.